I'd like to first start off by saying welcome to Seattle. Washington is, my home. This is where I was raised. So I'm glad to see all of you here. This is a bit of a moment to be able to sit down in front of really some of the people that I've been on this journey with through my career and remind us a little bit of where we have been, where we are, and where we're going. This is actually great to look out and see so many people that I haven't seen over this last year and a half. So first off, thank you there. There's the next button. So when we look at the past, we look at where we are and where we're headed. We're gonna break this up into three major time breaks. Past, I'm gonna call everything previous to 2016. What led us up to this point in the industry. The present, we're going to call the last 5 years, and the future is not some far off future, but really the months and the years that are right at our doorstep. I think Bob hit it really well when he said that there is an urgency coming to the work that we need to do. So when we look at the past, we're not just looking at just some encyclopedia type story. We want to actually see and understand the stories that actually bring the moments to life. So we're going to look at something a little bit personal, a little bit warmer, and I'm going to try and walk you through this journey through the eyes of somebody that grew up in this space, in this industry, and actually how we got to where we are today. So I've been telling a lot of you for my whole life that I have grown up in the Seattle area. And it was not this Seattle, it was the Seattle that was at the foothills of the Olympic Mountains, where every fall when the rivers would flood, salmon would swim across the river. And we would end up sending people home because, who knew when the road would actually clear off. But it was also the same part of Seattle where Bill Gates would spend his summers out vacationing on the Hood Canal, and you'd see him at the Burgermaster. It was a really weird place to grow up because you're in the middle of nowhere, but yet there's, Bill Gates with all the computer stuff going on there. In fact, there's some stories I could tell you about a water trampoline, the Mason County Sheriff's, Bill Gates property, and we'll leave that for a different day. But if we get a chance, I'll be glad to tell you that story. But as you look forward, I spent those years working to remove old Novell networks and try to bring out Windows NT Server. That was back when NT actually stood for new technology. Unfortunately, that is not where we are today. We also spent a ton of time ripping out old token ring and bringing in this new modern Ethernet thing. My summers were not spent flipping burgers, but actually on the backside of a Krempers dealing with T5688A connectors. It was a weird childhood. But what I'd like to say, we always saw problems the same way as we do today. When something went down, it was either the server needed to be rebooted or it was DNS. To this day, it is still DNS, so we may not have come as far as I'd like to think we have. Also during this time, cybersecurity was starting to gain just the inkling of pop culture awareness. You saw the game, you saw the movie War Games. To this day, the phrase, "shall we play a game," conjures up phrases of tic-tac-toe and thermonuclear war. We also, at that same point in time, saw the movie Hackers come out several years later, but that happened to be the exact same year that Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer did that wonderful dance up on stage to the Rolling Stones. We were just starting to see the mass adoption of this technology, but we were very unaware of what the security requirements would be. When we looked forward, we started to see that the end user authentication options in this space were all based on shared secrets. It was what was the password that was set up. How well could we keep that file that had all the passwords in it? It really relied on very simple human-entered text-based protocols for authentication. And in reality, many of the things had not moved all that far ahead. I'll never forget the time I first learned about why we needed PIN policies. That picture is a StarTAC phone. For those of you who don't remember those were the coolest thing back in the day. But what I found out, the hard lesson I learned is when you turn on PIN modes, you have to actually know what that PIN is to unlock. That was my father's phone I locked, and my penance was to actually sit there and brute force the PIN until I found it. I have learned in those days that PIN policies were really the only things that actually protected us. And we went a little wild with that and started to apply that to password policies. And before you knew it, we had very stringent and strong password policies, and users were revolting. The reality of that environment is it wasn't just us that was looking at how do we build password policies. The US federal government, not too much longer later, started implementing requirements about password policies. Those decisions in that day actually still stay with us today. The impact of those password policies, of trying to force users to rotate them, of actually trying to build security in that stood in the way of people just doing their jobs, hangs over our head. At that time, back when I was growing up, I was unaware of the other things that were emerging in the industry. At the same time, we were starting to see the emergence of early multi-factor authentication solutions. What you see on the right-hand side of the screen is actually a screenshot from the AT&T patent for using pagers for out-of-band OTP authentication. Now, this is back in the day where we were going to push everything via pager, and that was how we were making MFA accessible to the masses. Well, pagers are not here anymore, but the same concepts are still applied. We had very simple authentication protocols, very simple hardware authenticators that relied on the construct of a shared secret. And one of the things I will continue to hit is shared secrets are phishable. And the problem that we have today resides with the fact that those shared secrets ultimately are something that you can trick a human into giving away. This was not the only solution out there for multi-factor authentication. When you start looking at what else was on the market during those days, you see a whole host of authentication solutions. I want to take a moment and thank John Haggard for these images, who, this collection of images is what we've experienced as an industry when we've dealt with authenticating. Smart cards, one-time passwords, challenge and response devices, external thumbprint readers for biometrics. We've tried all sorts of things, and they all failed for different reasons. One of the major reasons that they shared for is that one of the major reasons they failed is we had technology, but we did not have demands for the solutions or the requirements for people to deploy them. The technology became at a premium, and the technology was also not something that we were able to go wide with. Premium solutions are why we have seen in this time our MFA rollout to be limited to small user groups. It cost too much. It was too big of an impact. And it has, honestly, a long tail sorted back in these legacy devices. These devices did cost a lot. It was painful, and the only people that we could inflict them on were the IT operations and administrative people. But before we move on, I want to take a quick moment to highlight the key challenges in this. They were big. We had batteries that died. You have to have an authenticator. It always has to work. We had symmetric secrets. It was phishable. It was a poor user experience. And one of the things with that poor user experience and the symmetric secrets is we've evolved a phrase called the token necklace. I actually didn't have any good pictures of one of them back in the day, but if you had to sign into 10 different services and you needed MFA, you had 10 different tokens. And if you had to go on vacation and be able to remotely access anything, you had to take those 10 different tokens with you. And heaven forbid you lose those, because that was your next month trying to recover access to all your accounts. That one device per secret is a huge barrier to adoption in any MFA solution. So as we move forward, I'm going to start talking a little bit about how that past impacted our present. That present, again, as I said, was a 5-year window. That 5-year window, I'm going to start it at 2016 just because I needed a window. But back in 2016, let's take a quick reminder of where we were. We were seeing mass adoption of single sign-on. We were actually in conversations. I cannot remember the number of conversations I had with people about what multi-factor authentication was. Was this multi-factor authentication? Was it 1.5 factors? The half factor of authentication, I hope we finally killed, but we'll talk through all of those conversations here. Back in that time, you were seeing the first, OpenID Connect. That RFC had been ratified in 2014, and in 2016, you're starting to see rapid adoption. FIDO had launched both the UAF specification and the U2F specification. Zero trust and these concepts were being introduced and talked about really from a lot of your network providers. Biometrics were becoming accessible. They were built into the iPhones in about 2013. And so these capabilities were starting to emerge at scale, but we were still stuck. We weren't seeing adoption. We weren't seeing MFA rolled out. And why is that? I would say that we had authentication options, especially available in the enterprise, that were broken into three major categories. We had mobile out-of-band apps, send you push messages. Those would work for everyone that had a cell phone. Those would work for information workers that were in environments where they could use cell phones, but they were phishable. We had auth apps. We had standardized OTP that let us go to scale with a lot of solutions. Again, requiring applications and requiring a phishable credential. And we had smart cards. Smart cards were a great solution, but they were difficult for actually deploying. You had to manage PKI. And we'd spent a whole career investigating and obfuscating how PKI worked to people. We had acronym soup in that environment that you had to understand what the difference was between a CRL and OCSP and be able to roll through why that impacted people. We were stuck. The solutions that were secure enough weren't usable, and the solutions that were usable weren't secure enough. All the while, breaches were continuing to occur. Public pressure was ramping up because the regulation still hadn't caught up. For those of us in this space, 2017 was the year that 863.3 got released. It's only been 4 years ago, but that document, in my perspective, actually unlocked a lot of additional regulatory change because they had to start over. We had to actually find regulation that allowed us to scale to allow people to opt in to better security. The people in this room were instrumental in getting that done. So I'm not going to sit here and talk to you about what happened because you know it. But what that did was it unlocked the ability for us to move forward. But for us to truly break that stalemate, we needed three major things. We needed better authentication. We actually needed that better authentication to matter in how it was deployed. And I'll talk about that in the zero trust context. And we needed continuing updates to the regulation. So let's talk a little bit about better authentication. This is Authenticate. This is a FIDO alliance. We are talking about authentication. I work at Yubico. This matters greatly to us. With FIDO 2, what we saw was all of the lessons from the history, the pains of the past, actually being incorporated into solutions that we could go build. A lot of times FIDO 2 is talked about as passwordless MFA, and bringing that passwordless experience there. But when you're talking about passwordless, what you're really talking about is a phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication method that is easy for consumers and enterprise users alike to adopt. There were some key pains that we addressed in FIDO 2. First was we had hardware with asymmetric cryptography involved in it. We got rid of the phishing problem. Okay? Secondly, there were no shared secrets between those organizations, which meant that that token necklace we had now could be much smaller and now could live within a single device. But if we're going to do that, we actually had to bind those keys to an origin so that we protected privacy, so that we weren't sharing who we could log in with all across the internet. We couldn't recreate the cookie problem of the past. Really, one of the things I'm most proud about working with a lot of you in this entire industry was the fact that we got to the stage where there is native browser and platform support. Any of you who've been involved with standards, any of you who've been involved, actually let me just back up. Anyone who has deployed software knows that if I don't have to deploy another software client for my project to be successful, my odds have increased significantly. Native browser and platform support is huge in unlocking what our future is going to be in this space. If we are able to know that the cell phones that people are refreshing every several years are, Android and iPhones now have security key and FIDO passwordless authentications built into them, we know that our applications are reaching a broader audience day by day. The addressable market of who we can help is expanding. When we look at those early years, there is one story to me, though, that I do want to share. I don't think I've ever really shared this publicly. We were working with Microsoft, and our CTO, Jacob Ahrensvard, was actually here in Seattle. We were actually doing a company conference in this very hotel, and we had been working with Microsoft to actually try and prototype what could this FIDO thing look like. We've been exchanging paper, we've been exchanging ideas written down. But Jacob, our CTO, I drove him from here over to the campus at Redmond, and we met up with Phil Hallen. Phil is one of the senior Windows engineers, deep in crypto, but I'm trying to describe really two really nice but grumpy old men that have been in this industry for a long time. And when they got in that room and they plugged this stuff together and it worked on the first try, I was literally watching Phil and Jacob bounce around that room like they had just won the World Series. And in many ways, maybe we had. I do believe that passwordless authentication is actually going to have a greater impact on our world and our society than winning a single World Series ever will. This will actually change how computer authentication is done, potentially as a generational change in our whole society. One of the things that I would like to talk about a little bit, though, is how does better authentication become useful? If we just put better authentication on a single identity provider and we roll it out in a small niche, have we actually solved the problem? And that's where the focus and the ideas behind Zero Trust have come in. How do we minimize the places where trust is just transited? That being on the network was good enough to get access to these applications. You know, the concept behind Zero Trust is that we got to get rid of that center GUI core. The idea that we can just get into a network and move laterally throughout it is something that has to go. So bringing strong authentication together with Zero Trust starts to be a very compelling story for us, but it wasn't enough. We also needed updated regulation. So this timeline slide's a little bit of an eye chart, but what I want to call out to you is really at the right-hand side of it, you start to see the movement in the government policy and changes that have occurred. 2020, you saw the cybersecurity maturity model certification launch within the DoD. 2021, you saw President Biden sign the executive order in May. Not just a couple of weeks ago, you saw CISA release an update to that specification that said phishing-resistant authentication is the requirement. Phishing-resistant authentication is the requirement, is the foundational piece for what I want to talk about as we move forward. Our solutions of the present focused us on deploying good enough authentication for some of the people, some of the time. What we are faced with is the costs of that decision. We have very specific problems that we have to address as we move forward with what we are doing. We have a technical debt from this race to the cloud. We have applications everywhere, on-prem, in operational environments, in our data centers that we haven't figured out if or how we will ever move those to the cloud and connect them. We have the costs of good enough authentication, and really we have the mindsets of good enough authentication to contend with. This was good enough, this met the policy, this got me through the door. But the reality is what we are seeing is good enough isn't good enough for us any longer. Phishing has led to real-world impact. We've seen pipelines shut down. We've seen grocers not be able to deliver goods. The impact of these cybersecurity problems and this ransomware is hitting everyday people where they live, and we are aware of cybersecurity in a way we haven't been in the past. But I will still say the catalyst that will force the change in these coming months and this next year is really going to be tied back to that executive order. What you've seen with President Biden signing this order, and then what you see with the law he just recently signed around cybersecurity for education, K through 12 education in the US public sector, will change what is being required for authentication. If the federal government's requiring its employees to have phishing-resistant authentication, and the same organization is building policy for education, phishing-resistant authentication may be what is required as guidance for all organizations. Their plan is not just for government employees, but it's to also roll it out to citizens. One of the things that you will catch in the latest CISA guidance is that phishing-resistant authentication must be an option for all public-facing services. So that means we, if you're a US citizen, you will have choice in how you interact and how you register yourself with these websites at the federal level. Let me ask a question. Is zero trust in and of itself the answer? We see a lot of conversations about zero trust. I've had probably a half dozen of them just today alone. And what does that impact and what does that mean? I want us to ground ourselves in what zero trust is. If you go to what the NCCOE put out in their latest project, zero trust is segmenting networks and requiring reliable authentication and authorization. That network segmentation and that access to those resources does not work without reliable authentication. So what I believe I'm trying to say is there is no zero trust without trusted authentication. You cannot deploy zero trust and see the return on your investment if you have not included trusted authentication. And what I think we are seeing, good enough authentication is not the bar for trusted. We need phishing-resistant authentication for this to work. Phishing-resistant authentication has to become the bar by which we are evaluating everything. Bob told you a little bit earlier today about how to get started, how to roll this out. I argue it is critical for us to start making these moves. I do sincerely look forward to the day that I'm not up here talking about phishing-resistant authentication. I can just say authentication. I don't have to get all tongue-tied and twisted over having to be so specific about what we are talking about that we can actually communicate clearly. If you want to go back to those history slides, we used to shorten authentication into authn because it was too much to type and say. And I've just made it worse. So let us get to the stage where phishing-resistant authentication is authentication for us. I do look forward to having an opportunity to speak with all of you. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to take them. I'll be here throughout the week. But I'll just simply say, my name's Derek Hansen. I really appreciate you listening to my story. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.